The sun was a smear of orange sinking into the horizon, casting a sickly glow over the crumbling remnants of the town. The air carried a damp chill, laced with the faint briny tang of salt water that seemed to seep into everything it touched. Buildings stood like empty shells, their windows gaping wide, the glass long gone, leaving only jagged edges that caught the fading light like broken teeth. We shouldn't have been here. That much was clear, but we were drawn to this place, as if the tide itself had pulled us in, silent and unrelenting. The first sign that something was wrong came with the wind, or the lack of it. The air had been alive earlier, swirling and shifting, as though the ocean were breathing its last. But now, as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared beneath the waves, everything stopped. The air was heavy, motionless, pressing against my skin like a suffocating weight. Even the sound of the waves, which had been a constant background hum, seemed to fade, leaving a silence that felt too large for the space it occupied. I scanned the horizon, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The beam cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating jagged rocks, slick with algae, their surfaces gleaming like the scales of something ancient. Beyond them, the ocean stretched out endlessly, a void of inky black water that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. My chest tightened as I tried to breathe through the oppressive quiet, the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and uneven in my ears. We had split up, which had been a mistake, but we were too focused on our tasks to care. The others were somewhere deeper in the town, searching the abandoned buildings for any trace of the rituals that had once been performed here. My assignment had been simpler, or so I thought. Enderdeedle. Document the shoreline, capture evidence of the unnatural tides that had plagued this place for decades. It sounded straightforward, but standing here, alone with the encroaching darkness, and the weight of the silence pressing down on me, it felt anything but. The tide was moving in. I could see it now. The water creeping closer, lapping at the edges of the rocks with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed almost predatory. It wasn't fast, not like the videos I'd seen, where the waves had surged in like an unstoppable wall, swallowing everything in their path. No, this was different. This was worse. It was patient, unhurried, as though it knew there was no need to rush. The town was already its. My camera beeped faintly, the red recording light blinking to life as I adjusted the focus. The screen flickered for a moment, static crawling across the image before it stabilized. I aimed it at the shoreline, capturing the movement of the water as it climbed higher, each wave reaching farther than the last. The rocks were slick and glistening now, the algae shining like oil under the weak beam of my flashlight. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the uneven terrain, distorted by the rippling water. But it moved, slowly and deliberately, sliding across the surface like a ripple that didn't belong. It was dark, darker than the water around it, its edges blurred and shifting as though it were only partially there. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, my hands tightening on the camera as I zoomed in. The shape was large, much larger than I'd realized. It wasn't just a shadow. It had formless, a presence that seemed to pull the air from my lungs and replace it with something sharp and metallic. It moved closer, the water rippling around it in unnatural patterns, the surface breaking and reforming as though the ocean itself were recoiling from its touch. I couldn't look away, even as every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and leave this place behind. The camera flickered again, the screen distorting, lines of static crawling across the image like cracks in glass. The shape was clearer now, its form flickering at the edges, as though it couldn't quite hold itself together. I could make out limbs, or something like limbs, twisting and writhing beneath the surface, their movements slow and deliberate, each motion sending ripples through the water that seemed to reach toward me. The tide surged suddenly, the water rushing forward with a force that sent a spray of salt and foam cascading over the rocks. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the ground, its beam casting wild, erratic shadows that danced across the shoreline. The shape was gone, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. But the water kept moving, rising faster now, spilling over the rocks and pooling around my feet. I reached for the flashlight, my hands trembling as I fumbled with it, the beam flickering weakly as I swung it back toward the water. The tide was higher than it should have been, lapping at the edges of the path that led back into town. The air was colder now, the chill sinking deep into my bones, making my breath visible in the weak light. And then I heard it, a sound, low and guttural, rising from the water like a voice trapped beneath the surface. It wasn't a word, not exactly, but it carried meaning, threading through the silence, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't calling to me, it was commanding me. My camera slipped from my hands, landing in the shallow water with a dull splash, the screen flickering weakly before going dark. The tide was higher now, the water swirling around my ankles, pulling at me with a force that felt deliberate, as though it were trying to drag me forward. I took a step back, my legs trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and then the shadow emerged. It rose from the water like a specter, its form towering and indistinct, its edges flickering and unstable. It wasn't solid, it couldn't be, but its presence was undeniable, pressing against me like a wave, heavy and suffocating. The sound came again, louder this time, threading through the air like smoke, filling the space with a resonance that made my chest ache and my head pound. The tide surged again, the water rushing forward, swallowing the path, the rocks, everything in its path. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the slick surface, the sound of the water crashing behind me, the shadow looming in the corner of my vision. The town was ahead, its crumbling buildings bathed in the weak light of my flickering flashlight. But the tide was faster, relentless, pulling at me with every step. The ocean wasn't just rising, It was coming for me. The streets of the abandoned town were barely more than skeletal remnants of what they had once been. Cracked asphalt, split like old scars, weeds and salt grass bursting through the fissures, their tips swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. The buildings loomed around me, dark and hollow, their warped doors and broken windows staring down like unblinking eyes. My flashlight wavered in my hand, the beam cutting erratically through the gloom. The silence was no longer empty. It was alive, pressing against me, threading through the air like unseen hands reaching for my skin. The tide's distant roar filled the edges of the quiet, the sound carrying with it a rhythmic cadence, like the slow, deliberate breaths of something massive. I could feel it behind me, that weight from the shore, pulsing in time with the waves. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I pressed deeper into the heart of the town, searching for the others. I'd lost sight of them during my flight from the water's edge, and now every building looked the same, each one warped and leaning, their shapes blurring in the encroaching darkness. A flicker of movement caught the edge of my vision, and I turned sharply, the flashlight beam darting toward the source. The light fell on a rusted sign, swaying faintly in the breeze. Blackwater Grocery. Its letters were nearly illegible, faded and peeling, the metal beneath streaked with rust. The door beneath the sign hung ajar, creaking softly, though the air was still. I hesitated for a moment, the pit in my stomach twisting tighter, before stepping toward it, my fingers brushing against the rotted wood. Inside, the air was damp and sour, carrying the stale scent of decay that made me gag. Rows of empty shelves stretched into the shadows, their metal frames bent and corroded, like they'd been left to rot for decades. The floor beneath me squelched with every step, the sound sharp and unnatural, like it was amplified by the oppressive quiet. I swung the flashlight slowly across the room, the beam catching on shards of broken glass scattered across the floor, their surfaces gleaming like fragments of bone. Then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the tide. It wasn't coming from outside. It was here, threading through the shadows, low and guttural, vibrating through the stale air. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the source, the flashlight beam catching on something at the far end of the store. A figure. It stood half-shrouded in darkness, its outline barely visible in the weak light. At first, I thought it was one of the others. Maybe they'd come looking for me. But the longer I stared, the less human it seemed. Its limbs were too long, its body bent at unnatural angles, its head tilted sharply to one side, as though it were studying me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused. The whispering grew louder, threading through the air, crashing and overlapping, forming a chaotic symphony that seemed to rise from every corner of the room. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, the sound of its footfalls muffled, like it wasn't quite touching the ground. The light from my flashlight wavered as I tried to hold it steady, the beam flickering and dimming, as though the darkness itself were fighting to consume it. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a vibration, a resonance that sank deep into my chest, threading through my thoughts, filling me with a meaning I couldn't comprehend, but couldn't deny. The words weren't meant for me. They were meant for something larger, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against the edges of my mind. You shouldn't have come. The sound hit me like a physical force, driving me back a step, my breath leaving my lungs in a sharp gasp. The figure tilted its head further, the motion sharp and unnatural, its hollow gaze fixed on me, threading through the fragile threads of who I was, unraveling them with a precision that felt deliberate. My knees buckled as the whispering surged, crashing together in a deafening roar that filled the space, shaking the walls, the shelves, the floor beneath me. I stumbled back, my shoulders slamming against the edge of the doorframe as I turned and bolted into the night. The air outside felt heavier now, the darkness thicker, pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like chains. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps as I ran. The sound of my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty streets. The town seemed different now, its buildings leaning closer, their shadows stretching across the cracked pavement, reaching for me like twisted fingers. I didn't know where I was going. The streets all looked the same, the landmarks indistinguishable in the shifting dark. The sound of the tide was louder now, crashing against the edges of the town, each wave rising higher, pulling closer, its rhythm unrelenting. The whispering was still there, threading through the air, clinging to the edges of my thoughts, pulling at me, unraveling me. And then I saw the light. It flickered faintly in the distance, casting weak, uneven shadows across the street. My chest tightened as I moved toward it, each step heavy and deliberate, my legs trembling beneath me. The light was coming from an open doorway, its frame bent and splintered, the wood streaked with salt and decay. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering and dimming as though the air itself was suffocating it. The room was small, cramped, its walls lined with shelves that sagged beneath the weight of old, waterlogged books. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rot, each breath burning in my chest. In the center of the room was a table, its surface covered in papers and objects that seemed to pulse faintly with the same unnatural light as the doorway. And then I noticed the notebook. It lay open on the table, its pages yellowed and brittle, the writing inside scrawled in a hand so jagged it looked like scratches. The symbols twisted and writhed on the page, their shapes shifting as I stared at them, their meaning threading through my thoughts like needles. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, the whispers surging louder, filling the room with a sound that was unbearable, inescapable. The light flared brighter, consuming the space, and then everything went dark. The darkness wasn't a void. It was alive. It clung to my skin, pressed into my chest, coiled around my thoughts. The air was heavy, damp and sharp, with the metallic tang of salt, and something bitter that lingered at the back of my throat. My breathing felt loud and uneven, each inhale catching like a knife in my lungs. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond the muffled thud of my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. But I could feel it. The presence in the darkness, watching, waiting. The floor beneath me was damp and uneven, the surface slick beneath my trembling hands as I pushed myself upright. The memory of the light, the jagged, unnatural glow of the notebook, lingered in the edges of my vision like an afterimage burned into my mind. I reached blindly for the flashlight. I dropped, my fingers brushing against its cold metal frame. The beam flickered weakly as I turned it on, casting faint, erratic light that barely penetrated the thick, suffocating dark. The room had changed. The walls were closer now, warped and uneven, their surfaces streaked with something dark and glistening that caught the light in jagged reflections. The shelves were gone, replaced by jagged outcroppings of stone that jutted from the floor and ceiling, their surfaces rough and unnatural. The air was colder, sharp, and biting, each breath visible in the weak light as a thin plume of mist. And then I heard it, the sound of water, faint at first, like the gentle lapping of waves against a distant shore, but it grew louder, closer, threading through the silence like a living thing. It wasn't rhythmic. It was chaotic, uneven, crashing against the edges of the room in waves that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. My pulse quickened as I swung the flashlight toward the source, the beam trembling in my hand. The water was rising. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was seeping in from everywhere, threading through the cracks in the stone, pooling in the uneven ground, climbing higher with every second. The sound grew louder, a deafening roar that filled the space, vibrating through the air, through my chest, through the fragile edges of my thoughts. The whispers returned, threading through the roar, their fragmented voices clashing and overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony that made my head pound. I turned toward the doorway, or where the doorway had been. The light from it was gone, swallowed by the encroaching dark, leaving nothing but a jagged outline carved into the stone. The water was at my ankles now, icy and biting, its surface swirling and rippling unnaturally, its movements sharp and deliberate. It wasn't just water. It was something more, something alive, threading through the room, pulling at me with a force that made my knees buckle. The whispers surged, their voices sharper now, threading through the roar, pulling at the edges of my mind. I stumbled forward, my steps unsteady, the water dragging at my legs, the darkness pressing against my chest. The flashlight flickered again, its beam dimming, casting erratic, jagged shadows across the walls that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. And then I saw it. The figure from before was back. Or maybe it had never left. It stood motionless in the center of the room, its form barely visible in the weak light, its edges flickering and unstable. It was taller now, its limbs stretched unnaturally, its head tilted sharply to one side, as though it was studying me. The whispers grew louder as I met its gaze, its hollow, empty gaze that seemed to pierce through the fragile threads of who I was, unraveling me with a precision that felt cruel in its deliberate care. The water surged, rising to my knees, swirling violently around the figure, its movements sharp and chaotic, as though it were drawn to the thing that loomed before me. My flashlight beam caught on its surface, illuminating something beneath the water, something massive that moved with slow, deliberate motions, its shape too large and indistinct to comprehend. My stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, threading through the air, through the water, through me. The figure moved, its limbs unfolded with a jagged, unnatural grace, its movements slow and deliberate, each motion bending the space around it, distorting the air, the water, the light. It didn't walk. It didn't need to. The space seemed to shift around it, bending and twisting to accommodate its presence. Whoa. It stopped just in front of me, its hollow gaze fixed on mine, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the fragile remnants of who I was. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound. It was a vibration, a resonance that sank deep into my chest, threading through the edges of my mind, filling me with a meaning I couldn't understand but couldn't deny. The depths await. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs, making my knees buckle beneath me. The water surged again, rising to my waist, its surface swirling and rippling violently, pulling at me with a force that made it impossible to stand. The whispers were deafening now, their voices crashing together in a chaotic symphony that filled the space, shaking the walls, the water, the air. The figure leaned closer, its presence pressing against me, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the last fragile threads of who I was. The water climbed higher, swirling around my chest, my neck, my face, until it was all I could feel, all I could hear, all I could see. And then the light went out. The world returned, not in pieces, but in waves. My lungs burned as I coughed violently, water spilling from my mouth, its metallic tang sharp and bitter. My fingers clawed at the ground beneath me, cold, wet, and uneven, as I struggled to push myself upright. Every breath felt like dragging in shards of glass, my chest aching with each labored inhale. The darkness was still there, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my skin and threading through my thoughts. But now, it was different. It wasn't just around me. It was inside me, clinging to the edges of my mind like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I was no longer in the room. The ground beneath me wasn't smooth stone, but something rough and uneven, scattered with jagged shards that bit into my palms when I moved. My flashlight was gone, its faint beam swallowed by the darkness, leaving me to fumble blindly in the cold, damp air. I squinted into the void, my vision adjusting slowly, shapes emerging from the shadows like phantoms. The walls were no longer close. They stretched out into the distance, towering monoliths of jagged rock that seemed to sway faintly, as though they were breathing. The sound of water was everywhere, dripping from unseen cracks above, rushing in chaotic streams below, echoing through the vast, empty space. It wasn't just water. It carried something else, a low, guttural hum, that vibrated through the ground, through my chest, through the fragile threads of who I was. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me, my breaths shallow and uneven. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, each inhale a struggle against the weight of the space. The ground sloped downward, the uneven surface slick and treacherous, forcing me to move slowly, deliberately. The darkness pressed closer with every step, threading through my skin, sinking deeper into my chest. And then I saw it. The light was faint, barely more than a flicker on the edge of my vision, but it was there, cutting through the darkness like a jagged shard. It wasn't steady. It pulsed faintly, in time with the low hum that vibrated through the space, casting jagged shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. I moved toward it, my steps slow and hesitant, my hands outstretched to steady myself against the uneven terrain. The light was coming from an archway carved into the rock, its edges jagged and uneven, as though it had been torn from the stone by something massive. Symbols were etched into its surface, their shapes sharp and angular, glowing faintly with the same flickering light that pulsed through the space. They seemed to move when I looked at them, their edges shifting and twisting, threading through the air like smoke. Beyond the archway was a staircase, its steps slick with water, leading down into a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. The light was brighter here, spilling upward in uneven bursts, illuminating the jagged walls and the shadows that clung to them. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the stone, through my chest, through my thoughts, filling the space with a resonance that made my head ache, my vision blur. I hesitated at the edge of the staircase, the pit in my stomach twisting tighter as I peered into the darkness below. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, each breath burning in my chest. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of my vision, twisting and writhing like living things, their shapes too fluid and unnatural to be anything I could comprehend. And then the whispers returned. They weren't faint this time. They crashed through the silence like a wave, their voices clashing and overlapping, threading through the space, filling it with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in the stone, the water, the shadows, threading through everything, pulling at the edges of my mind. The light flared brighter, sharper, spilling out from the archway, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the staircase, each step heavy and deliberate. The sound of my footsteps swallowed almost immediately by the suffocating hum. The whispers grew louder with every step, their voices clashing and overlapping, forming a chaotic symphony that filled the void, shaking the walls, the ground, the air. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber that stretched out endlessly, its edges swallowed by the darkness. The light pulsed brighter here, spilling out from the center of the space, illuminating a structure that made my stomach churn and my chest tighten. It was a pedestal carved from the same jagged rock as the walls, its surface etched with symbols that writhed and twisted like living things. Atop the pedestal was a sphere, its surface dark and shimmering, threads of light pulsing through it like veins. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the air, through the stone, through me, filling the space with a resonance that made my teeth ache, my thoughts blur. The whispers surged, louder now, their voices crashing together, filling the chamber with a sound that was overwhelming, inescapable. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, sharp and deliberate, threading through the space, pulling at the edges of my mind. It waits. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs, making my knees buckle beneath me. The shadows twisted and writhed, their movements frantic and erratic, as though they were reacting to something I couldn't see. The light from the sphere flared brighter, spilling out in jagged bursts, illuminating the chamber, casting the shadows into sharper, more terrifying shapes. And then I saw it. It wasn't the sphere. It was behind it, or within it, or both. Its form was massive, towering, its edges flickering and unstable, its movements slow and deliberate, each motion bending the space around it. It wasn't just a presence, it was the space, threading through the chamber, through the shadows, through me, unraveling the fragile threads of who I was. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices crashing together, filling the space with a sound that made my head pound, my vision blur, my chest ache. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew heavier, sharper, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the last fragile remnants of who I was. And then, all at once, the light consumed everything. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me in a darkness so profound it felt alive. I could still feel the echoes of the light in my chest, pulsing faintly, threading through my thoughts, leaving jagged, broken fragments in its wake. My vision swam with after-images, flickers of the pedestal, the sphere, and the massive figure that had loomed over it. Each one burned into the edges of my mind like scars. The chamber was quiet now, but it wasn't empty. The air was thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing against my skin, heavy and suffocating. The ground beneath me was cold and damp, the uneven surface biting into my palms. As I pushed myself upright, my breaths were shallow and uneven, each one a struggle against the weight of the space. The whispers hadn't left. They were quieter now, threading through the silence, faint and fragmented. But they were there, clinging to the edges of my mind, unraveling the fragile threads of who I was. I couldn't understand them, not fully, but their meaning was clear. They weren't just speaking to me. They were speaking through me, threading their truth into the hollow spaces left behind by the light. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me, the ground shifting and uneven. The chamber stretched out before me, its edges swallowed by the darkness, the faint glow of the pedestal, the only source of light. The sphere atop it pulsed faintly, its surface shimmering with threads of light that twisted and coiled like veins, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. The figure was gone, or at least, I couldn't see it, but its presence lingered, threading through the air, the stone, the whispers, pressing against me like a tide that wouldn't stop rising. My chest ached with the weight of it, My thoughts blurred and fragmented, each one unraveling as quickly as it formed. And then the ground shifted. It wasn't a subtle movement. It was a sudden violent lurch that sent me sprawling, my hands scraping against the rough stone as I fell. The chamber trembled, the walls groaning, the shadows twisting and writhing in time with the movement. The pedestal remained still, the sphere atop it glowing brighter, its light spilling out in jagged bursts that cut through the darkness. The whispers surged again, their voices louder now, crashing and overlapping, filling the chamber with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were in the stone, the light, the water that dripped from the walls, threading through everything, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling the fragile threads that held it together. The ground shifted again, the movement sharper this time, sending cracks spidering out from the base of the pedestal, their jagged edges glowing faintly in the light. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning in my chest, each second stretching into eternity. The whispers weren't just speaking now. They were commanding, their meaning threading through the air, through me, carving itself into the fragile remnants of who I was. Bring it. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs, making my knees buckle beneath me. The sphere's light flared brighter, sharper, spilling out in jagged bursts that illuminated the chamber, casting the shadows into sharper, more terrifying shapes. The cracks in the ground widened, the light spilling out brighter, sharper, cutting through the darkness with a force that made my vision blur. My head ached. I stumbled forward, my body moving on its own, the whispers threading through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind, unraveling me piece by piece. The pedestal loomed before me now, its surface jagged and uneven, the symbols carved into it glowing faintly, their shapes twisting and coiling like living things. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light sharp and jagged, its surface shifting and unstable, as though it were barely holding itself together. The whispers surged again, louder now, their voices clashing and overlapping, threading through the air, through the stone, through me. My hand reached out, trembling, my fingers brushing against the sphere's surface. It was cold, impossibly cold, the chill sinking deep into my skin, threading through my bones, my chest, my mind. The light flared brighter, consuming everything, and then the chamber was gone. I was standing in the middle of the town again, the crumbling buildings looming around me, their shadows long and distorted. In the faint light of the moon, the ground beneath me was damp and uneven, the scent of salt and decay thick in the air, threading through my lungs with each shallow breath. The whispers were quieter now, threading through the silence, faint and fragmented, but they were still there, clinging to the edges of my mind. The sphere was in my hands. Its surface pulsed faintly, the light within it threading through the cracks in its surface, twisting and coiling like veins. It wasn't heavy, not physically, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against my chest, my thoughts threading through me like chains. The whispers surged again, louder now, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the space with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. The tide was higher now, the water lapping at the edges of the buildings, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't just water. It was alive, threading through the streets, pooling in the shadows, reaching for me with a force that felt deliberate, predatory. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light spilling out in jagged bursts that cut through the darkness, casting the water into sharper, more terrifying shapes. The whispers weren't just in my mind anymore. They were everywhere, threading through the air, the water, the light, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling the fragile threads that held it together. The sphere's light flared, brighter, sharper, spilling out in jagged bursts that illuminated the town, casting the shadows into sharper, more terrifying shapes. And then the tide surged, swallowing everything. The water wasn't just rising, it was alive. The tide surged in waves that defied logic, curling and crashing with a force that shook the ground beneath my feet. My hands clung to the sphere, its surface cold and slick, the pulsing light from within threading through my thoughts like a fevered pulse. The whispers were louder now, clashing and overlapping, filling the air with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. They weren't speaking to me anymore. They were inside me, unraveling the fragile threads of my mind, carving their meaning into my soul. The town was gone, at least the town I'd known. The crumbling buildings that had once stood as hollow monuments to what had been were now warped and twisted, their outlines flickering and unstable. Shadows stretched and twisted across the waterlogged streets, their movements sharp and unnatural, like living things trying to pull themselves free. The air was heavy with salt and decay, each breath burning in my chest, as though the atmosphere itself had turned hostile. I stumbled forward, the weight of the sphere pulling at me, dragging me toward the heart of the town, or what was left of it. The whispers grew louder with every step, their voices crashing together in a chaotic symphony that vibrated through the air, through the water, through me. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light cutting through the darkness in jagged bursts, casting twisted, erratic shadows that danced across the broken remnants of the town. The tide was everywhere now, flooding the streets, swallowing the ground beneath my feet, its surface rippling and swirling as though something massive moved beneath it. I tried to move faster, but the water was pulling at me, its cold grip threading through my legs, dragging me backward with a force that felt deliberate, malevolent. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps as I fought against the current, each step heavier than the last. And then I saw it, the center of the town, the square where we'd started, where the others had first split off, was transformed. The water pooled there, deeper than anywhere else, a black shimmering void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The sphere pulsed brighter in my hands, its light spilling out in sharp, uneven bursts that illuminated the edges of the square, casting the twisted remnants of the buildings into stark, jagged relief. The whispers surged again, louder now, their voices threading through the air, the water, the light, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling the fragile threads that held it together. The sphere grew colder in my hands, its surface trembling faintly, the light within it twisting and coiling like veins. It wasn't just an object. It was alive, pulsing with a presence that pressed against my chest, my thoughts threading through me like chains. The water in the square rippled violently, the surface breaking and reforming, as though something massive moved beneath it. The shadows at the edges of the light twisted and writhed, their movements sharp and unnatural, their shapes too fluid and unstable to belong to anything human. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices crashing together, filling the air with a sound that made my head pound, my vision blur, my chest ache. And then it emerged. The water erupted in a spray of salt and foam, the sound crashing through the square like a thunderclap, shaking the ground, the air, the fragile remnants of the town. The figure that rose from the depths was massive, its form towering and indistinct, its edges flickering and unstable. It wasn't just a shape. It was the water, the shadows, the whispers, everything coalescing into a single, impossible presence. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, its form too vast to comprehend. Its surface shimmered with threads of light that twisted and coiled like veins, threading through the water, the air, the shadows, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling everything it touched. Its head tilted sharply, its hollow gaze fixed on me, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the fragile remnants of who I was. The sphere in my hands pulsed brighter, its light spilling out in sharp, uneven bursts that cut through the darkness, illuminating the figure in jagged, terrifying detail. The whispers surged again, louder now, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the air with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. Bring it to me. The words weren't just sound. They were a force, sinking deep into my chest, threading through my thoughts, filling the hollow spaces left behind by the whispers. My legs moved on their own, carrying me closer to the square, the water pulling at me with a force that felt both relentless and inescapable. The sphere grew heavier in my hands, its light sharper, brighter, spilling out in jagged bursts that illuminated the shadows, the water, the figure. The ground beneath me shifted, the water rising higher, swirling violently around my legs, pulling at me with a force that made it impossible to stop. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Its presence was everywhere, threading through the air, the water, the light, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling the fragile threads that held it together. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices crashing together, filling the air with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light spilling out in sharp, uneven bursts that illuminated the figure. The square, the water, casting everything into sharper, more terrifying shapes. And then the ground gave way beneath me. I fell into the water, the cold biting into my skin, threading through my chest, my mind pulling me downward with a force that was both physical and something else. The sphere slipped from my hands, its light fading as it sank, its presence threading through the water, through me, pulling at the edges of who I was, unraveling me piece by piece. The figure loomed above me, its form bending and twisting, its hollow gaze fixed on me, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the last fragile threads of who I was. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, filling the water with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. And then, all at once, the light consumed everything. The light wasn't warm or soothing. It was cold, sharp, and invasive, slicing through the water and threading into my thoughts like icy tendrils. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. It didn't matter. The light was everywhere, flooding my senses, pressing against my skin, sinking into the hollow spaces the whispers had carved out. I couldn't move. My body felt weightless, suspended in the endless void of the water. Yet every inch of me was weighted down by the crushing presence that surrounded me. I wasn't drowning. I should have been, but the water wasn't water anymore. It was something else, something thicker, heavier, pulsing faintly against my skin like it was alive. My lungs didn't ache for air. My chest didn't burn. But my mind, it screamed. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were inside me, unraveling the fragile threads of my thoughts, pulling apart the pieces of who I was, reshaping them into something I couldn't recognize. The figure loomed above me, its form distorted by the shifting light, its edges flickering and unstable. It wasn't just watching me, it was inside me, threading through my chest, my thoughts, unraveling me with a precision that felt deliberate, surgical. Its hollow gaze bore into me, piercing through the fragments of my mind, leaving nothing untouched. The sphere was still there, sinking slowly into the depths, its light pulsing faintly, casting jagged shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was part of the figure, part of the whispers, part of me. I could feel its presence threading through the water, through the light, pulling at the edges of my existence, binding me to something I couldn't comprehend, but couldn't escape. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, threading through the water, the light, the shadows, filling the void with a sound that was both unbearable and inescapable. They weren't just voices anymore. They were commands, carving themselves into the hollow spaces left behind by the figure's presence, threading through the fragments of who I was, leaving no part of me untouched. You are the vessel. The words weren't spoken. They were carved into me, threading through my thoughts, sinking deep into the spaces left behind by the whispers. I didn't understand what they meant, but I could feel their weight pressing against my chest, threading through the water, the light, the shadows. I wasn't just me anymore. Sulal, eerie. I was part of it, part of the tide, part of the whispers, part of the figure. The light pulsed brighter, sharper, slicing through the water with a force that made my vision blur, my head ache, my chest tighten. The sphere stopped sinking, its light spilling out in jagged bursts that illuminated the figure, the water, the void. The shadows twisted and writhed, their movements frantic and erratic, as though they were trying to escape the light, the whispers, the presence. And then the tide surged. The water rushed upward, pulling me with it, dragging me through the light, the shadows, the whispers. The figure didn't move, but its presence grew stronger, heavier, threading through the water. The light, the void, pressing against me with a weight that made it impossible to think, to breathe, to be. The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were actions, threading through the tide, through the light, through me, unraveling the last fragile threads of who I was. The town reappeared in flashes, jagged and distorted, its crumbling buildings twisting and writhing like shadows caught in the light. The water was everywhere now, swallowing the streets, the buildings, the remnants of what had been. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light spilling out in sharp, uneven bursts that cut through the water, illuminating the town, the tide, the figure. I was no longer moving of my own accord. The tide carried me forward, the water threading through my limbs, my chest, my thoughts, pulling me toward the square, the heart of the town, the heart of the tide. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and overlapping, threading through the water, the light, the shadows, filling the void with a sound that was both overwhelming and hollow. The square was gone. In its place was a vortex, a swirling void of water and light, its edges sharp and jagged, its presence consuming. The figure loomed above it, its form bending and twisting, its hollow gaze fixed on me, threading through my thoughts, unraveling the last fragile remnants of who I was. The whispers surged again, their voices louder now, their meaning sharper, threading through the tide, the light, the void, carving themselves into the hollow spaces left behind by the figure. Complete the cycle. Shivers and burned dire. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light spilling out in jagged bursts that cut through the water, the light, the shadows. I could feel its presence threading through the tide, the whispers, the figure binding us all together in a way that was both terrifying and inescapable. The water surged again, pulling me closer to the vortex, the figure, the light. I didn't resist. I couldn't. I wasn't just me anymore. I was part of it, part of the tide, part of the whispers, part of the figure. The sphere pulsed brighter, its light consuming everything, threading through the water, the light, the void, pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling the fragile threads that held it together. And then, all at once, the light went out. The air felt heavier the moment we crossed the rusted gate into Blackwood Forest. It wasn't the kind of heaviness you could blame on the thick canopy of leaves or the humid summer night. No, this was the kind of weight that settled into your chest and refused to leave. Like a whisper you couldn't quite hear but couldn't ignore either. Every step forward seemed to pull me deeper into something unseen, something waiting. Mark led the way with a flashlight, its beam bouncing erratically off the gnarled tree trunks. Behind him, Emily clung to Jacob's arm, her nervous laughter grating against the oppressive silence. I trailed slightly behind, my own unease growing with every crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The stories about Blackwood were as old as the town itself. Kids dared each other to spend the night here, swearing they'd heard screams that didn't belong to any animal or seen shadows that moved against the wind. Most dismissed them as drunken tales or the imagination of bored teenagers. Hebrew teenagers. But now, standing under the ancient trees, I could feel something watching, something alive. It was Mark who found the cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of years. "Check this out," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. None of us wanted to follow, but the unspoken rule of the group kept us moving. Strength in numbers, I told myself. The door creaked as Mark pushed it open, revealing a room cloaked in darkness. The flashlight's beam illuminated broken furniture, scattered debris, and walls stained with something I didn't want to name. In the far corner, an old rocking chair swayed slightly, though no breeze touched it. "That's creepy," Emily murmured, breaking the silence. We stepped inside, and the air turned colder, sharper. My breath fogged in front of me as I scanned the room. Then I saw it, marks scratched into the walls, jagged and uneven, like someone had carved them in a frenzy. At first, they looked random, but as I traced their patterns, my stomach dropped. They weren't random. They were symbols, crude but deliberate. Jacob pointed to the floor, where more symbols formed a circle around a pile of charred wood and ash. "This was some kind of ritual," he muttered, his voice low. "Let's get out of here," Emily said, pulling at Jacob's sleeve. But Mark, ever the skeptic, crouched by the ash. "It's just some local prank. Probably teenagers trying to scare people off." When he reached for a piece of charred wood, but the moment his fingers touched it, the room shifted. The shadows grew darker, pooling in the corners, like ink spreading across paper. A low hum vibrated through the walls, rising in pitch until it became a piercing whine. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it began, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same. This silence felt alive, pulsing, waiting. Mark stumbled back, clutching his hand. "It burned me," he hissed, showing a red welt spreading across his palm. The symbols on the wall began to glow faintly, a sickly red light that flickered like a dying flame. My eyes were drawn to one in particular, a symbol etched deeper than the rest, its lines sharp and purposeful. As I stared, I felt a pull, as if the mark itself was drawing me in, whispering secrets I couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. Sarah. Emily's voice broke through my trance. We need to go. Now. I nodded, but when I turned to the door, it wasn't there. The doorway we'd entered through was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of splintered wood. Panic clawed at my throat as I spun around, searching for another way out. But the cabin seemed to be shifting, its walls closing in. A sound broke through the panic. A low, guttural growl that didn't belong to anything human. It came from the shadows pooling near the rocking chair, which had started to creak slowly back and forth. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the encroaching darkness. And then I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glinting like shards of glass in the void. They blinked in unison, fixing on us with a predatory stillness. My breath hitched, and I felt my legs lock, frozen in place. The growl grew louder, and something began to emerge from the shadows. Not an animal, not a person. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong in this world. Its form was amorphous, shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But the eyes, those remained constant, piercing, hungry. Run! Mark's voice broke the spell, and my legs obeyed before my brain caught up. I bolted toward the far wall, where a window offered a narrow escape. Glass shattered around me as I threw myself through the window, hitting the ground hard. Pain flared in my knees and palms, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard the others crashing through the window, their breath ragged and panicked. We ran blindly into the forest, the flashlight bouncing wildly in Mark's hand. The growl followed us, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching higher, their roots twisting like skeletal fingers to trip us. My lungs burned, my heart thundered, but the only thought in my mind was to keep moving, to escape. Finally, we broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the dirt road that led back to town. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing, the distant chirp of crickets, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The growl was gone, but as I looked back at the forest, I saw them again. Those eyes watching us from the darkness. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Tranquil. It had begun. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and suffocatingly quiet under the dim light of the moon. My legs felt like lead, each step a battle against the pull of exhaustion. None of us spoke. The silence wasn't comforting. It was charged, alive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I glanced back over my shoulder. Eerie. The trees loomed in the distance, black and endless, their shadows spilling across the road like claws. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw movement. A flicker of something slipping between the trunks. My stomach twisted. I turned away before my mind could latch onto it, unwilling to confront whatever was still out there. Mark was the first to break the silence. What the hell was that? His voice cracked, raw and shaking. The beam of his flashlight trembled as he swept it across the empty road. Enormous, Sandy, double dying. No one answered. Hey. How could we? The truth was, none of us wanted to admit what we'd seen, or worse, that we didn't know what it was. Emily clung to Jacob's arm, her breathing shallow. We have to tell someone, she whispered, her words barely audible over the distant hum of cicadas. The police, the rangers, someone. And say what? Mark snapped, spinning around to face her. His face was pale, his eyes wide and frantic. That we saw. What? Shadows. Eyes. They'll laugh us out of the station. They won't laugh if they find us dead in a ditch. Emily shot back, her voice trembling. I wanted to intervene, to say something that would ground us. But my mind was spinning too fast, replaying every moment in that cabin. The symbols, the ash, the growl, and those eyes staring at us with a hunger that wasn't natural. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine and wrapped my arms around myself, as though I could shield against the memory. We can't just go home, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. Whatever that was, it's not done with us. I know you felt it too. That thing. It's watching, waiting. Mark shook his head, his jaw tightening. You don't know that. I didn't respond. Deep down, I knew I was right. We walked in tense silence for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time felt strange now, stretched thin and fragile, as though it could snap at any moment. The road ahead was endless, a dark ribbon winding into oblivion. Then Jacob stopped abruptly. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice low. We froze, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but the rhythmic hum of insects. Then I heard it, a faint sound, barely there, like a soft murmur carried on the breeze. It grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand, a language that felt ancient and wrong. It's coming from the forest, Jacob said, his eyes darting to the trees. No, Emily said, her voice high-pitched. We're not going back in there. We don't have a choice, Jacob replied, his tone grim. If we don't figure out what's happening, it will come to us. You know it will. Before anyone could argue, he stepped off the road and onto the forest's edge, disappearing into the shadows. Damn it, Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. We can't just leave him. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I followed. The others hesitated for a moment, then fell in step behind me. The forest felt different now, its silence oppressive, as though the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. The murmuring grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. They weren't meant for us. They were meant for something older, something darker. We found Jacob standing in a small clearing, his flashlight illuminating a figure carved from wood. It was tall and grotesque, its limbs twisted unnaturally, its face featureless except for a gaping hole where its mouth should have been. Around its base, the ground was scorched, the dirt blackened and cracked. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. Jacob didn't answer. He was staring at the figure, his expression blank, his body rigid. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The murmuring was loud now, almost deafening, and it seemed to emanate from the figure itself, though its carved mouth remained still. As I reached for Jacob's shoulder, his head snapped toward me, his eyes wild. "It's watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's always been watching." The words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The scorched earth cracked open, releasing a foul stench that made my stomach churn. A low, guttural growl echoed from the fissure, the same sound we'd heard in the cabin. "Run!" someone shouted, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted in place, my gaze locked on the figure. Its head was turning slowly, impossibly, as though it were alive. The hole where its mouth should have been began to widen, and from its depths came a sound that wasn't a growl, but a scream, raw and endless, filled with anguish and rage. The trees around us began to twist and warp, their branches stretching toward us like skeletal hands. The murmuring turned into a cacophony, 1,000 voices overlapping, their words incomprehensible, but heavy with intent. Jacob grabbed my arm, yanking me back into motion. I stumbled after him, the others close behind, as we tore through the forest. The ground shook violently, roots bursting from the earth in our path. I tripped and fell hard, my palms scraping against the dirt. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The clearing was empty, the murmuring silenced. But the forest was different now, darker, denser. The trees seemed closer, their trunks twisted unnaturally. And then I saw them, more figures, identical to the one in the clearing, scattered throughout the forest. They stood motionless, their carved mouths open wide, as though screaming in silent agony. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just a forest, it was a graveyard, and we had awakened something that should have stayed buried. The realization hit me like a blow, and I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. We had to get out, now. No, but even as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter. Whatever we had unleashed wasn't confined to the forest. It was everywhere. And it was coming for us. The darkness around us wasn't natural. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, a breathing entity that seemed to press against my skin, seeping into my thoughts. Every step we took felt like walking deeper into its grasp. But stopping wasn't an option. The forest stretched in all directions, endless and unyielding, and no matter how far we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't moving at all. The trees whispered as we passed, their branches groaning against the faint wind that somehow didn't reach us. I could feel it now. Something unseen, just out of reach, watching, waiting. Every instinct I had screamed to turn back. But back to where? There was no safety left behind us. No salvation ahead. Only the void. Then came the sound. It started as a low hum, distant and faint, but it grew louder with each step. It wasn't like before, not the murmurs or growls we'd heard earlier. This was rhythmic, pulsing, almost mechanical. It was coming from all around us, rising and falling like some macabre heartbeat. "Keep moving," Mark said sharply, his voice tense. His flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely illuminating the path ahead. "Sst." I could hear the fear in his tone, the way his words trembled, and it mirrored my own panic. But then Jacob stopped, turning toward the sound. "Wait," he said, his voice distant, almost hypnotized. "Do you hear it? It's calling us." "Jacob." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. My voice cracked under the weight of my own fear. "Hey, we can't stop. Don't you see what's happening? It's trying to pull us in." But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on something in the shadows, something I couldn't see but could feel. A presence, oppressive and consuming. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through my chest, until it felt like it was a part of me. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an unbearable void that pressed down on us. For a moment I thought we were safe, that whatever it was had disappeared. But then I saw it, a shadow shifting in the darkness, unnatural and wrong. It didn't move like an animal or a person. It moved with intent, calculated and deliberate. Emily let out a small gasp, clutching at Mark as the shadow grew, stretching across the ground toward us. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat as the darkness seemed to solidify, taking shape. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like water spilling across the earth. Jacob stepped forward. "Eduville, in da." "No," he said softly, almost reverently. "It's not here to hurt us. It's here to show us." "Jacob, stop," I shouted, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the thing. Before I could reach him, the shadow surged forward, wrapping around him like smoke. He didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his eyes wide and unblinking as the darkness consumed him. And then he was gone. "Jacob," Emily's voice cracked, her panic spilling over. She darted forward, but Mark grabbed her, pulling her back. "We can't help him," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to go." But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body rooted to the spot As I stared at the place where Jacob had been, the shadow lingered, pulsing and writhing, as though it were alive. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and invasive, and I knew it was coming for us next. "Sarah, move!" Mark shouted, his voice snapping me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding as we turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and shifting as though they were alive. Every step felt like a struggle, the ground beneath us soft and unsteady, as if the earth itself were trying to pull us under. Emily stumbled, letting out a cry as she fell to her knees. She gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this. Who? If you any want to do this?" I grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "You don't have a choice," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. "We have to keep going." But even as I said the words, I knew it was pointless. The forest wasn't letting us go. It was playing with us, toying with our fear, feeding on it. The hum returned, louder this time, more insistent. It seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through my bones. Elevating my bones. I could feel it in my chest, in my teeth, a relentless pulse that refused to be ignored. And then the ground beneath us shifted. The earth cracked and split, sending jagged fissures through the forest floor. From the cracks came a sickly red light, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living things. "Go!" Mark shouted, pushing us forward. We ran, the ground crumbling beneath our feet, the light growing brighter and more blinding with each step. I could feel the heat of it now, searing and oppressive, and the hum had turned into a roar, deafening and relentless. Then the ground gave way entirely. I fell, the air rushing past me as I tumbled into the abyss. My body hit the ground hard, pain radiating through me as I struggled to breathe. When I opened my eyes, the forest was gone. We were somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay, and the only light came from the faint red glow that pulsed through the walls around us. Mark and Emily were beside me, their faces pale and terrified. But Jacob was gone, and in his place was only the shadow, watching us with unblinking eyes. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that we were exactly where it wanted us to be. Oh, the world around me felt like a dream warped into a nightmare. Every detail sharper than reality, yet disturbingly wrong. The air in this place was heavy, thick with a metallic tang that stung my nostrils and clung to my throat. The walls pulsed faintly, their surface uneven and almost fleshy, as though the very ground was alive. I didn't know where we were, but I knew one thing for certain. We weren't in Blackwood anymore. Mark groaned beside me, clutching at his arm where he must have landed wrong. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his sleeve, but he didn't seem to notice. Emily huddled on the floor, rocking back and forth, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and her eyes darted around wildly, never settling on one spot for too long. "Where are we?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, trembling as though she was afraid the walls themselves might answer. I shook my head, unable to find words. There was no explaining this, no logic, no reason. All I knew was that we were somewhere beneath the forest, buried in a place that should exist. And yet it felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us for centuries. The red glow grew stronger as I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky beneath me. The walls seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, and as I moved closer to them, I saw markings etched into the surface, symbols like the ones in the cabin, jagged and alien, their meaning just out of reach, but undeniable in their malevolence. Mark stumbled to his feet, wincing as he cradled his injured arm. "And it'll be with stewards to ghost. We need to find a way out," he said, his voice rough and uneven. "Whatever this place is, we can't stay here." Emily let out a bitter laugh, the sound high-pitched and jagged. "You think there's a way out? Look around, Mark. We're trapped. It wants us here." "Stop it," I snapped, the sharpness in my voice surprising even me. "We can't fall apart now. We'll figure this out." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. This place didn't feel like somewhere you escaped from. It felt like a final destination. The ground beneath us shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I turned, scanning the space for any sign of an exit, but all I saw were endless corridors stretching into the darkness. Each one seemed taken, promising safety, but exuding danger. Mark took the lead, his flashlight flickering weakly as he chose a path at random. Emily clung to me as we followed, her fingers digging into my arm hard enough to leave bruises. I didn't pull away. Her fear mirrored my own, and as much as I wanted to be strong, I needed the connection to ground me. The corridor twisted and turned, narrowing until the walls were so close they brushed our shoulders. The symbols glowed brighter the further we went, their light casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered. I kept my eyes forward, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that we were being watched, that the shadows themselves were alive. Then we saw it. A door. It stood at the end of the corridor, impossibly tall and made of dark, aged wood. Strange runes covered its surface, and the faint red glow seemed to seep through the cracks. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's handle. "Do we open it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We don't have a choice," I said, though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back. The door creaked as Mark pushed it open, revealing a chamber that stole the breath from my lungs. The room was massive, the walls stretching so high they disappeared into darkness. At its center stood an altar, crude and ancient, surrounded by more of those symbols etched deep into the stone floor. And there, on the altar, was Jacob. He lay motionless, his body pale and rigid, his arms crossed over his chest. Strange black markings snaked across his skin, pulsing faintly with the same red light that filled the room. His eyes were closed, but his face was contorted in an expression of pain, or perhaps something worse. Jakob! Emily broke free from my grasp, rushing toward the altar. Emily, wait! I shouted, but it was too late. She reached him and grabbed his hand, shaking him desperately. Jakob, wake up, please. His eyes snapped open, and the air seemed to shift. He sat up slowly, unnaturally, his movements jerky and inhuman, his gaze locked on Emily. But there was no recognition in his eyes. They were black, empty voids that seemed to consume the light around them. Emily, he said, his voice layered with something deep and guttural. It wasn't his voice. It was something using his body, his face, to speak. Emily froze, her hand still gripping his. Jakob, it's me. We're here to help you. He tilted his head, studying her with a cold curiosity. Then he smiled. A twisted, unnatural grin that sent a shiver down my spine. You shouldn't have come. The words barely left his mouth before the symbols on the floor ignited, their light blinding and searing. The room filled with a deafening roar, a sound that felt like it was tearing through my very soul. I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes as the ground beneath us began to quake. Run, Mark shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. But Emily didn't move. She stood frozen in place, her gaze locked on Jacob as the light consumed him. The last thing I saw before Mark dragged me out was Jacob's face, his smile widening into something monstrous as the room erupted into chaos. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the light and sound. We stood there, panting and shaken, the silence oppressive and deafening. I turned to Mark, my voice barely a whisper. We need to find another way. But even as I said it, I knew there was no other way. This place wasn't going to let us go, not without a price. The silence after the door slammed shut was suffocating. My ears rang from the deafening roar in the chamber, and my legs felt like they were on the verge of collapsing. I leaned against the cold, pulsating wall, trying to steady my breathing, but the air in this place felt thick and raw. It wasn't just the fear. This place was alive, its very essence creeping into my lungs, into my mind. Mark slumped beside me, his face pale and glistening with sweat. She didn't come with us, he said, his voice hoarse and barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My brain refused to process what had happened to Emily, or to Jacob. The image of him, his face warped into that twisted grin, his voice layered with something ancient and terrible, played over and over in my mind. My chest tightened as I remembered Emily's frozen expression, the way she didn't move as the light swallowed her whole. Mark pushed himself off the wall and grabbed my shoulder. Sarah, he said, his voice sharper now. more desperate. We have to go back for her. I shook my head, the motion weak and automatic. She's gone, Mark. We can't. There's nothing we can do. You don't know that. His grip tightened, his eyes wide with panic. We don't leave her behind. We can't. But I did know. Deep down, I knew that whatever was in that room wasn't Emily or Jacob anymore. Sylvia Edipedia. It was something else. Something that had taken them both. I pulled away from him, my voice trembling as I said, "If we go back, we won't make it out. You saw what happened." Mark stared at me, his jaw clenched, his breathing ragged. For a moment, I thought he might fight me on it, but then his shoulders slumped, and he looked away. "So, what do we do?" he muttered, his voice hollow. I didn't have an answer. The corridor stretched out before us, its walls pulsing faintly with that sickening red light. Every direction felt like a trap, each step leading us deeper into this nightmare. But standing still wasn't an option. This place was alive, and it wouldn't let us linger for long. "We keep moving," I said, finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "There has to be a way out. We just have to find it." Mark nodded reluctantly, and we started walking again. The corridor seemed to twist and turn endlessly, its angles unnatural and disorienting. The pulsing light grew dimmer the further we went, casting long shadows that writhed and shifted like they had minds of their own. I avoided looking at them, but I could feel their presence, cold and menacing, trailing us like predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air grew colder, and the walls began to change. The pulsating surface gave way to jagged stone, slick with some dark, unidentifiable substance. The symbols were still there, etched deep into the rock, but they looked different now, cruder, almost frenzied, as if whoever had carved them was in a state of panic. Mark stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to silence me. I froze, straining my ears, and heard it, a faint, distant sound like the echo of footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my pulse quickening. The footsteps were growing louder, uneven, and shuffling, as though whatever was making them wasn't walking so much as dragging itself forward. The shadows along the walls seemed to ripple in anticipation, stretching toward the sound. "Run," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. We took off down the corridor, the sound of our own frantic footsteps drowning out the approaching noise. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out. But the terror driving me forward was stronger than the exhaustion. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, the thing behind us, closing in. The corridor opened into a wide chamber, and I skidded to a halt, nearly crashing into muck. The room was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness, and at its center stood a massive structure, an altar far larger than the one we'd seen before. It was made of black stone, its surface slick and glistening, as though it were sweating. Symbols covered every inch of it, glowing faintly with the same red light that seemed to pulse through this entire place. Mark's flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, and that's when we saw them. Figures, dozens of them, stood in a circle around the altar. They were motionless, their bodies cloaked in shadow, but their presence was overwhelming. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't just standing there. They were watching us. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it emerged from the shadows, I saw its face, or what should have been its face. Its features were distorted. Its skin stretched and twisted as though it had been molded by hands that didn't understand human anatomy. Its eyes, black and empty, locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread settle deep in my chest. "We're not supposed to be here," Mark said, his voice trembling. The figure raised an arm, its hand outstretched, and the symbols on the altar flared to life. The room was bathed in a blinding red light, and the air grew heavy with the sound of whispers. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the far side of the room. "We have to move," I shouted over the noise. We sprinted across the chamber, the whispers growing louder with every step. The figures didn't follow us, but I could feel their eyes on us, cold and unrelenting. The light from the altar seemed to stretch toward us, its glow seeping into the cracks of the stone floor, chasing us like a living thing. We reached another corridor and plunged into its darkness, the whispers fading behind us. My legs felt like they might give out, and my lungs ached with every breath, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. As we ran, the ground beneath us began to tremble, and the walls started to close in. The corridor twisted and warped, its angles impossible, and I felt the overwhelming sense that we were being funneled, herded like cattle towards something we couldn't escape. And then we saw it, a faint light ahead, flickering like a dying flame. It wasn't the oppressive red glow we'd come to fear, but something softer, warmer. It was a beacon in the darkness, a sliver of hope in this endless nightmare. We stumbled toward it, desperate and breathless, the corridor opening into another chamber. But as I stepped inside, the light vanished, and I realized too late that the hope it had offered was a lie. The moment the light vanished, an icy grip tightened around my chest. My breath hitched, and the darkness seemed to close in, suffocating and absolute. I stumbled forward blindly, my outstretched hands grasping at nothing, the walls of the chamber swallowing us whole. Behind me, Mark's breathing was ragged, his fear palpable in the oppressive silence. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling, "are you there?" "Yeah," he croaked, though his voice sounded distant, like he was struggling against the same weight, pressing down on me. "What happened to the light?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew the glow hadn't just disappeared. It had been extinguished, deliberately. This place was alive, and it was toying with us, unraveling whatever threads of hope we'd been clinging to. My pulse pounded in my ears, every beat a countdown. I couldn't stop. A faint sound, broke through the stillness. A soft scratching, like nails dragging across stone. It started quietly, distant, almost imperceptible. Then it grew louder, closer, echoing through the chamber, like the ticking of some malevolent clock. "Something's here," Mark said, his voice barely audible. I reached for him, finding his arm in the darkness and gripping it tightly. His skin was cold and clammy, trembling under my touch. "We have to move," I said, though my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. "We can't stay here." We fumbled forward, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the silence. The scratching continued, relentless, its rhythm uneven, like whatever was making it was crawling toward us. My heart raced as we stumbled deeper into the unknown, guided only by the faintest glimmers of instinct. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us shifted. I lost my balance, falling hard onto the slick stone floor. Pain shot through my knees and palms as I scrambled to my feet, my breathing shallow and panicked. "Sarah," Mark hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me upright. What was that? Before I could answer, a low rumble vibrated through the chamber. A sound so deep it felt like it came from the earth itself. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to pulse, a living, breathing thing that tightened its grip on us with every passing second. "Run," I said, my voice barely more than a breath. We took off, our footsteps frantic and uneven as we navigated the twisting passage. The rumble grew louder, the scratching now joined by a faint guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words were indecipherable, but their intent was clear. This place wanted us, and it wasn't going to let us go. The corridor opened suddenly, spilling us into another chamber. This one was smaller, its walls lined with strange, jagged markings that glowed faintly in the darkness. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface smooth and polished, reflecting the dim light like a pool of black water. On the pedestal lay a book. Its cover was dark and worn, its edges frayed as though it had been handled countless times. Symbols identical to the ones on the walls were etched into its surface, their glow pulsating faintly, almost beckoning. Mark hesitated, his gaze locked on the book. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low and wary. I shook my head, my gut screaming at me to leave it alone. "We shouldn't touch it," I said. "It's wrong." But Mark stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the object like it held the answers to everything. "Maybe it's a way out," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "Maybe it's a clue." "Mark, don't," I started, but it was too late. His hand hovered over the book, and as his fingers brushed the surface, the room erupted in a blinding red light. A deafening roar filled the chamber, and the air grew thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. The walls trembled, the symbols on them flaring to life, their light searing and blinding. I shielded my eyes, but I could still see the shapes forming in the air around us, shadows twisting and writhing, their forms grotesque and impossible. Mark stumbled back, his hands clutching his head as he let out a choked gasp. He started, but his voice cut off, replaced by a guttural scream that tore through the air like a blade. "Mark!" I shouted, rushing to his side, but before I could reach him, the shadows converged, their shapes melding into a single, towering figure. Its form was amorphous, its edges shifting like smoke, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It loomed over us, its eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, two endless voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic chorus that drowned out every thought, every sound, until there was nothing left but their maddening hum. Mark collapsed to the ground, his body writhing as the shadows enveloped him. I screamed, reaching out for him, but my hands passed through the darkness as though it wasn't there. He turned to me, his eyes wide and filled with terror, and for a moment I saw the Mark I knew. Then he was gone. The shadows consumed him completely, and the figure turned its gaze to me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short. Panicked gasp. "Stay back," I whispered, though the words felt meaningless. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and rippling like water. Its presence was unbearable, pressing down on me with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. I felt the ground beneath me give way, and I fell, tumbling into the void as the whispers followed me, their voices echoing in my mind. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. The chamber was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The air was cold, and the only sound was the faint, steady hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then in the distance, I saw it, a faint light flickering like a dying flame. My heart clenched as I realized it wasn't a beacon. It was a warning. It was a bericht. Oh, the faint flicker of the distant light was impossible to ignore, though every part of me screamed to stay where I was. It pulsed weakly, as though fighting against the oppressive darkness surrounding it. I hesitated, my feet planted on the cold, invisible ground beneath me, but the hum in the air grew louder, insistent, pulling me forward whether I wanted to move or not. I took a step, then another, my body trembling with each motion. The darkness around me seemed to shift, alive with whispers, too low to understand, but too present to ignore. My breaths came short and shallow as I approached the light, its weak glow growing steadier with every step. It wasn't hope that drove me forward. It was something else entirely. An instinct I couldn't explain. A knowledge deep in my bones that whatever waited for me wasn't salvation but an ending. Still, I walked, because staying in that empty void felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. The ground beneath me began to change. It was no longer the smooth, featureless surface I had been walking on. Now, it was rough, uneven and cold. The air grew denser, colder, until my skin prickled with goosebumps. The light loomed closer, revealing the outline of a massive structure, a door. This door was unlike the others. It was enormous, its surface carved with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly, the same ominous red glow that had followed us throughout this nightmare. But this time, the light felt different. It wasn't just a warning. It was a demand. I reached out, my hand trembling as my fingers brushed the door's surface. The moment I made contact, the symbols flared to life, and the air around me roared with sound. It wasn't the whispers this time. It was a single guttural voice that seemed to speak directly into my mind. Its words incomprehensible, but filled with intent. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. The walls were lined with statues, grotesque and towering, their faces twisted into expressions of agony and rage. At the center of the room was an altar, larger and more elaborate than any we had seen before. Its surface was covered in symbols that glowed with a blinding intensity, their light reflecting off the blood-red pool surrounding it. And there, standing at the edge of the altar, was Mark. "Mark?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Pain." He turned slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his expression unreadable. But it wasn't just Mark standing there. Surrounding him were the figures, those shadowed beings with warped faces and empty eyes. They moved in unison, their steps silent, their focus entirely on me. "You shouldn't have come," Mark said, his voice layered with something darker, something inhuman. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "What happened to you?" "Mark, it's me. We can still get out of here." His hollow eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. Recognition, maybe even regret. But then it was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. "There is no way out," he said. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Shh. The figures began to move closer, their shapes shifting and blurring, as though they weren't entirely solid. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the symbols on the altar flared brighter, casting jagged shadows across the room. I stepped back, my mind racing. "Mark, you don't have to do this. Whatever this place is, it's using you. Fight it." But he only smiled, a cold, twisted grin that sent a shiver down my spine. I already did, and I lost. The figures surged forward, and I ran. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might collapse. But I didn't stop. The room seemed endless, the walls stretching and shifting as though they were alive, trying to trap me. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic, their voices drowning out my thoughts. I stumbled and fell hard, my hands scraping against the rough stone floor. When I looked up, I saw it, a small, glowing object on the ground ahead of me. It was a knife, its blade etched with the same symbols that adorned the altar. Wow, pulsed faintly, almost as though it were alive. I grabbed it, the metal cold against my skin. The moment my fingers wrapped around the hilt, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, and the figures froze, their empty eyes fixed on me. Even Mark hesitated, his head tilting, as though he were listening to something I couldn't hear. "You think that will save you?" he asked, his voice mocking. I didn't answer. I didn't know if it would save me, but it was the only thing I had. The figures moved again, faster this time, their forms blurring as they surged toward me. I raised the knife, its blade glowing brighter, as the first figure reached me. I slashed at it, and the others hesitated, their movements faltering. I didn't wait. I ran toward the altar, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. Mark stepped in my path, his expression unreadable. "Don't," he said, his voice low. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I don't care," I said, pushing past him. The altar pulsed as I approached, its light growing blinding. The symbols seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into something new, something I couldn't comprehend. I raised the knife, the blade trembling in my hand, and brought it down onto the altar. The room erupted in light and sound, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath me. The figures screamed, their forms dissolving into shadows that were consumed by the light. Mark let out a choked cry, his body collapsing to the ground as the symbols on the altar burned brighter, their glow filling the room until there was nothing left but white. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the forest floor. Suli halivait medavadida ribandig. The air was cool, the sky above me clear and filled with stars. The oppressive weight of the place was gone, but so were Mark, Jacob, and Emily. I sat up, the knife still clutched in my hand. Its blade was dull now, its glow extinguished, but the symbols remained, etched deep into the metal. I stared at it, my chest tight with a mixture of relief and dread. The forest was quiet, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I had done, whatever I had unleashed, it wasn't gone. It was waiting. And it was only a matter of time. The moment we crossed into the ashen grove, the air felt different. Thicker, colder, almost electric. The trees loomed over us, their branches clawing at the darkening sky, as if trying to hold back the last light of day. Every step we took seemed to echo, though the ground beneath our feet was soft and damp, muffling sound. It was as if the forest itself was amplifying our presence, making sure we couldn't slip through unnoticed. I clutched the map tighter in my hands, the edges worn and curling under the pressure of my grip. The inked markings felt alive, the faded lines and symbols leading us to this place, this cursed place that the town refused to speak about. Behind me, the others walked in tense silence. Derek had insisted on coming, despite the warnings. Engbies, Dolma. Lucas, his younger brother, had practically bounded ahead at first, eager for whatever adventure he thought this would be. Now, even his steps were slower, his confidence chipped away by the unnatural quiet. We shouldn't have come here. The thought had been whispering in the back of my mind since we'd left town, growing louder with every step. The townspeople's warnings had been vague, just enough to fuel my curiosity, but not enough to convince me to turn back. The Ashen Grove isn't safe, they'd said. They didn't explain why, just that it was a place better left alone, forgotten, like the ashes that had buried it 50 years ago. But the map had called to me in a way I couldn't explain. The faded handwriting scrawled across its surface, the X marking a spot deep within the grove. It had been waiting for someone to find it, I was sure of that. And now, here we were, following its lead into the heart of something we didn't understand. The trees began to thin, revealing a clearing up ahead. At its center stood the structure we'd been searching for. Half buried in ash and overgrowth, the entrance to the underground house yawned open like a mouth, its wooden frame charred and brittle from the fire that had ravaged this place decades ago. My stomach twisted at the sight. There was something unnatural about it, something that made the air around it feel heavier, harder to breathe. Without a word, we approached. The steps leading down into the house creaked under our weight, the sound breaking the oppressive silence like a scream. The smell of damp earth and decay grew stronger with each step, wrapping around us like a shroud. The light from our flashlights wavered as we descended, the beams cutting through the darkness, but unable to dispel it completely. The first room was small, its walls covered in soot and graffiti left by those brave, or foolish, enough to venture here before us. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the remnants of a fireplace stood against one wall, its blackened bricks crumbling. But it was the symbols etched into the walls that caught my attention. They were jagged and uneven, carved deep into the wood, as if whoever had made them had been desperate, frantic. I ran my fingers over one of the marks, the grooves sharp against my skin. They felt old, older than the fire, older than the house itself. A chill ran through me, and I pulled my hand back, wiping it on my jeans, as if I could rid myself of whatever had seeped into me from that touch. Lucas let out a low whistle, his flashlight trained on a spot in the corner. I turned to see what he'd found, and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a book, thick and bound in cracked leather, its cover covered in more of those strange symbols. It sat atop a small makeshift altar made from bricks and bones, actual bones, bleached white and arranged in patterns, too deliberate to be random. Derek picked up the book, his face pale, but his hands steady. The room seemed to grow colder as he opened it. The pages stiff and yellowed with age. The text inside was written in a language I didn't recognize. Its letters sharp and angular, almost painful to look at. "We shouldn't touch that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt useless, even as I said them. Derek ignored me, flipping through the pages with growing urgency. Then he stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied one particular passage. Before I could ask what he'd found, a sound echoed through the room, a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The flashlight beams flickered, the darkness pressing in closer. "Enskilnilman," the sound grew louder, a deep vibration that rattled my teeth and made my chest ache. I grabbed Derek's arm, pulling him away from the altar. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. The door we'd entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging us into near total darkness. The only light now came from the weak glow of our flashlights, their beams barely cutting through the oppressive black. Lucas let out a string of curses, his voice high-pitched with fear. The noise in the walls grew louder, more insistent, and the symbols etched into the wood began to glow faintly, their red light casting eerie shadows across the room. My pulse thundered in my ears as the temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the room, despite the humidity outside. Then came the whispers. "Enteno, turns, Teun," soft at first, just a single voice muttering words I couldn't understand. But soon it was joined by others, overlapping and growing louder, until they were a chaotic cacophony of sound that made my head throb. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head. Something moved in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it, shifting and twisting in ways that made my stomach turn. It had no shape, no form, but it radiated malice, an overwhelming sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. "We have to get out," Derek said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. But the door was gone. The room was changing, the walls closing in, the floor shifting beneath our feet. The shadow in the corner grew larger, more solid, its presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as the shadow loomed closer. "Enduwa, Tateduga, Tatun." The whispers reached a crescendo, their words sharp and slicing, cutting through my mind like shards of glass. And then, with a deafening crack, the floor beneath us gave way. The fall seemed to stretch into eternity, the air rushing past my face, cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and rot. My body twisted uncontrollably, my flashlight flying from my grasp and plunging into the abyss. When I hit the ground, the impact sent a shockwave of pain through my limbs, knocking the breath from my lungs. The world spun as I struggled to sit up, gasping for air in the suffocating darkness. The whispers were gone, but the silence they left behind was worse. It wasn't just quiet. It was absolute, a void that pressed against my eardrums and made me feel like I was underwater. My heartbeat thundered in the emptiness, each thud echoing as though the sound had nowhere else to go. "Derek?" I croaked, my voice sounding foreign in the oppressive stillness. My hands scrabbled against the cold, uneven floor, searching for any sign of him. "Lucas, Nora." A faint groan to my left made me freeze. I turned toward the sound, my eyes straining to adjust to the pitch-black void. A weak beam of light flickered nearby, casting jagged shadows across the ground. I crawled toward it, my palms scraping against the gritty surface until my fingers brushed something solid. It was Derek. His flashlight lay beside him, the beam angled upward, illuminating the sharp planes of his face. His eyes fluttered open, and he let out a pained groan as he clutched his side. "What happened?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "The floor gave way," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he lied, wincing as he pushed himself into a sitting position. His flashlight's beam wavered, revealing more of our surroundings. The ground was uneven, a mix of dirt and jagged stone, and the air felt damp and cold, thick with an earthy musk. "Where are the others?" he asked, his voice sharpening with panic. I scanned the darkness, my heart sinking. I don't know. I can't see them." A sudden clatter to our right made us both jump, our flashlights snapping toward the source. The light revealed Nora, sprawled on the ground, her face pale and her breathing shallow. I scrambled toward her, my hands shaking as I helped her sit up. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with confusion. "What? Where are we?" she whispered. Before I could answer, a voice echoed from the darkness. A frantic, high-pitched cry. "Hello? Is anyone there?" "Lucas," Derek said, his voice tight with relief. He grabbed his flashlight and stood unsteadily, the beam slicing through the black void as he turned toward the sound. "We're here. Keep talking." "I'm stuck," Lucas shouted, his voice tinged with fear. "And it's so dark. I can't see anything." The three of us moved toward his voice, our footsteps crunching on the uneven ground. "Antiquend Dadarakanda. Constantly." My pulse quickened with every step, the oppressive silence around us amplifying the sound of our movement. The beam of Derek's flashlight finally found him, huddled against the base of what looked like a jagged stone pillar. "Oliver and Robert children, 1040. His leg was caught beneath a large piece of debris, his face pale with fear and pain. Derek knelt beside him, inspecting the debris. "It's not too heavy," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Mia, help me lift it." I crouched opposite him, bracing my hands against the cold, rough surface of the debris. Together, we heaved, the weight straining against our combined effort. Lucas gritted his teeth, his face contorting in pain as he tried to pull his leg free. After a tense moment, the debris shifted, and Lucas scrambled back, clutching his leg with a sharp intake of breath. "You okay?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He nodded, though his face was tight with pain. "I think it's just bruised. I can still walk." We helped him to his feet, the beam of Derek's flashlight illuminating the space around us. The faint light revealed what looked like a massive cavern, its walls rough and jagged, lined with strange markings that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dark. The symbols were angular and jagged, carved deep into the stone, their patterns twisting and overlapping like a tangled web. "What is this place?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nobody answered. The air was heavy with unspoken fear, the oppressive weight of the cavern pressing down on us. The light from our flashlights flickered, their beams too weak to pierce the vast darkness. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. A sense of being watched creeping over me. "We need to find a way out," Derek said, his voice firm but low. "Staying here isn't an option." We moved as a group, our footsteps hesitant and uneven. The cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls shifting and narrowing as we walked. The faint glow of the symbols grew stronger, the deeper we went, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist at the edges of our vision. Then the whispers returned, faint at first, just a soft murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But as we moved, they grew louder, their tone sharp and insistent. The words were foreign, unintelligible, but their intent was clear. They weren't welcoming us. They were warning us. Lucas stopped abruptly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my pulse quickening. "Keep moving. We can't stop here." But the ground beneath us trembled, a low vibration that sent loose rocks tumbling from the cavern walls. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound that made my head throb. Then, from the darkness ahead, a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker at the edge of the flashlight's beam. Pentagon, Tabitha's bee. But it grew, taking shape as it approached. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was shifting, fluid, its edges rippling like smoke, but its presence was solid, oppressive, a wave of cold malice that radiated outward. "Run," Derek said, his voice barely more than a breath. We turned and ran, our footsteps frantic and uneven as the shadows surged toward us. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step, their words slicing through the air like jagged glass. My chest burned, my breaths coming in sharp gasps as the cavern twisted and narrowed around us. Ahead, a faint light flickered, a weak, pulsing glow that promised escape. We sprinted toward it, the ground beneath us shaking with every step. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the shadow closing in behind us, its form stretching and twisting like a living nightmare. We burst through the light, collapsing onto cold, uneven ground. The whispers stopped abruptly, the silence that followed ringing in my ears. My chest heaved as I looked around, my flashlight casting weak beams across the new space. Wow! We weren't safe. Not yet. The light had only led us deeper. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness, pressing down on my chest like a weight. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I scanned the new space we had stumbled into. The weak, pulsing glow from the walls revealed jagged edges and uneven stone, the cavern narrowing around us like a predator closing in. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the lingering whispers still buzzed faintly at the back of my mind, a reminder that we weren't alone. Nora leaned against a nearby rock, clutching her side. Enu. Her face was pale, her breath shaky. Lucas sat on the ground, his legs stretched out in front of him, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Derek was pacing, his gaze darting between the faintly glowing symbols etched into the stone walls. "We can't keep running," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "Whatever this place is, it's designed to trap us. Moving blindly is just making it worse." I glanced at the markings on the walls, the sharp lines and angular shapes, twisting into patterns that made my eyes ache if I looked too long. They seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive, reacting to our presence. I reached out hesitantly, my fingertips brushing against the cold stone. A sharp jolt shot through my hand, and I recoiled, clutching it against my chest. "There's something wrong with them," I said, my voice trembling. "They're not just carvings. They feel alive." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his flashlight beam casting jagged shadows across the walls. "Alive? Like they're watching us?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The symbols seemed to ripple in response, their faint light flickering as though mocking us. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, unwilling to stay close to them any longer. Derek stopped pacing and turned to me, his jaw tight. "We need to figure out what they mean," he said, gesturing toward the symbols. "They're all over this place. They must be a clue. Something that explains what's happening. You think this place is giving us clues?" Nora said, her voice sharp with fear. "It's not trying to help us, Derek. It's trying to keep us here." Yen. Derek's shoulders tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he crouched near one of the walls, his flashlight angled to illuminate the markings. His eyes scanned the patterns, his expression shifting between frustration and unease. "Some of these symbols, they match what we saw in the book," he muttered. I knelt beside him, my pulse quickening, as I remembered the jagged symbols etched into the pages of the leather-bound journal. "The book mentioned something about a ritual," I said. "Something to bind or summon whatever's here." Lucas let out a low, humorless laugh. "Summon? So what? We're stuck in some kind of ancient trap. A ritual gone wrong. I didn't answer. My gaze was locked on the symbols, the way they seemed to twist and shift under the beam of Derek's flashlight. There was something about them, something that felt familiar, like I'd seen them before, even though I knew I hadn't. Before I could make sense of the thought, the ground beneath us trembled, a low vibration that sent loose stones tumbling from the walls. The faint light from the symbols grew brighter, their glow pulsing in time with the tremors. My heart raced as the whispers returned, louder this time, their chaotic chorus echoing through the cavern. "Something's coming," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. The glow from the symbols intensified, casting the chamber in an eerie red light. The air grew heavier, colder, each breath feeling like it was being pulled from my lungs. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, their shapes unnatural, their movements deliberate. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form barely visible against the pulsing red light. It was tall, its limbs elongated and twisted, its movements unnaturally fluid. It didn't walk. It glided, its body rippling like smoke, but solid enough to cast shadows. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank expanse of darkness, its emptiness more terrifying than any features could have been. I froze, my body refusing to move, as the figure loomed closer. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their overlapping voices drilling into my mind. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside me, clawing at my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with chaos. "Run!" Derek's voice snapped me out of my paralysis. "Wolu." We scrambled to our feet, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we fled down the nearest corridor. "Envelop." The whispers followed, relentless, their tone shifting from chaotic to commanding. The ground beneath us trembled with each step, the air around us growing colder, heavier. The corridor twisted and narrowed, the walls pressing in on us like a living thing. My chest burned, each breath a struggle as we pushed forward. The red glow from the symbols continued to light our path, but it felt more like it was leading us deeper into a trap than guiding us to safety. We burst into another chamber, larger than the last, its walls lined with more of the glowing symbols. At its center stood a pedestal, rough and jagged, its surface covered in dark, dried stains. The whispers quieted, replaced by a low, pulsing hum that seemed to emanate from the pedestal itself. Derek approached it cautiously, his flashlight beam illuminating the object resting on top. A small, jagged knife, its blade etched with the same symbols that adorned the walls. It pulsed faintly, the light from its markings matching the rhythm of the hum. "What is that?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. "Hey." Derek didn't answer. He reached out, his hand hovering over the blade. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the light from our flashlights. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Wah." We don't know what it does. Derek hesitated, his hand trembling. We don't have a choice, he said finally. Yet good Sovil, and act dextet. Whatever this place is, this thing is part of it. If we're going to get out of here, we need to figure out what it's for. Before I could stop him, his fingers closed around the hilt. The chamber erupted in light and sound, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath us. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their glow searing into my vision. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, their voices rising to a fever pitch. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light and sound vanished. The silence that followed was absolute, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Derek stood frozen, the knife clutched tightly in his hand, his face pale and his eyes wide. But we weren't alone. The shadows around us shifted, twisting and coalescing into forms that should exist. My heart pounded as I realized that whatever we had awakened wasn't going to let us leave. The silence after the eruption of light was deafening, a crushing stillness that pressed against my ears and made the hum of my own pulse feel unbearably loud. Derek still stood at the pedestal, the jagged knife clutched in his trembling hand. The symbols etched along its blade glowed faintly, their red light pulsing like a heartbeat. His face was pale. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Behind him, the shadows began to move. I saw it first, a ripple at the edge of the chamber, barely noticeable against the flickering glow of the symbols. But then it grew, stretching and twisting, its form wrong in a way I couldn't describe. It didn't have a shape, not exactly, but it felt deliberate, as though it was choosing to be undefined, just to unsettle us. Derek, I whispered, my voice tight with panic. Put it down. He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the blade, his grip tightening as if it was the only thing grounding him in this nightmare. The shadows crept closer, spreading across the floor like spilled ink. My flashlight wavered in my hand as I aimed it toward the movement, the beam barely piercing the thick, unnatural darkness. Lucas stumbled backward, his breathing ragged, his face a mask of terror. Derek, listen to her, Nora said, her voice trembling. Whatever that thing is, it's not worth it. Derek finally looked up, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he was waking from a dream. I think it's trying to tell me something, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Tell you what, I demanded, my fear spiking. Derek, it's not trying to help you. It's trying to... The shadows surged forward. The air grew colder, biting against my skin like ice, and the hum returned, louder and more insistent than before. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their glow searing and almost blinding. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming jagged shapes that moved with a terrifying purpose. One of them lunged. It didn't move like a person or even an animal. It moved like smoke caught in a storm, fluid and chaotic, yet with an unrelenting focus. Derek barely had time to react. He swung the knife instinctively, the blade cutting through the shadow with a sound like tearing fabric. The creature recoiled, its form unraveling into wisps of darkness that disappeared into the air. For a moment, it felt like we had won, like the knife had some kind of power over these things. But then the others moved. Dozens of shadows rose from the edges of the chamber, their forms solidifying as they closed in. "Run, Woon," I shouted, grabbing Nora's arm and pulling her toward the nearest corridor. Derek hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the knife. But Lucas shoved him forward. "Leave it. Leave it," Lucas yelled. "Just go." We sprinted into the darkness, our flashlights bouncing wildly as the symbols lining the walls flared and dimmed erratically. The hum followed us, growing louder, vibrating through the very ground beneath our feet. The shadows gave chase, their movements impossibly fast, their forms stretching and contorting as they pursued us. The corridor twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until we were practically scraping against the rough stone. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out. But I didn't dare stop. The whispers returned, sharp and overlapping, their chaotic voices drowning out the sound of our frantic footsteps. We burst into another chamber, larger than the last, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At its center stood a massive altar, its surface covered in jagged carvings that glowed with the same ominous red light. The air around it was thick, oppressive, as though the altar itself was alive. Derek stumbled to a stop, his eyes locking onto the altar. "This is it," he said, his voice breathless. "This is what the knife is for." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my panic rising. "We need to keep moving." But Derek didn't budge. He stepped toward the altar, his grip on the knife tightening. "The symbols, they're guiding us. This is the way out." Nora grabbed his arm, her voice frantic. "Derek, listen to yourself. You don't know what you're doing." He shook her off, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Heavy rain. I have to try. If I don't, we're not getting out of here." Before any of us could stop him, he stepped onto the altar and plunged the knife into a jagged slot. At its center, the reaction was immediate. The ground beneath us shook violently, cracks spidering out from the altar and glowing with an intense red light. The symbols on the walls flared brighter than ever, their light searing into my vision. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, their chaotic voices blending into a single guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber. The shadows froze, their forms rippling as if caught in a sudden wind. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought it was over, that Derek had done something to stop them. Then the altar cracked open. A wave of darkness erupted from its center, a living void that swallowed the light and filled the room with an unbearable cold. The shadows surged forward, their forms merging with the darkness, becoming something larger, something worse. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was a force, a weight that pressed against my chest and made it impossible to breathe. Derek screamed, his voice raw and desperate as the darkness engulfed him. I reached for him, but Lucas grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We can't help him," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. The darkness surged toward us, and we ran, the cold biting at our heels. The chamber twisted and warped around us, the walls shifting as though the entire structure was alive. The whispers followed, louder and more chaotic, their voices promising nothing but despair. We stumbled into another corridor, the air growing colder with every step. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Behind us, the roar of the altar faded, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. But the whispers didn't stop. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that whatever we had unleashed wasn't bound to the chamber. It was following us. The cold didn't relent. It clung to my skin, soaking into my bones like frostbite, setting in from the inside out. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each inhale feeling thinner than the last. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and narrowing, the jagged walls scraping against my shoulders as I stumbled forward. Behind us, the whispers persisted, their chaotic chorus gnawing at my thoughts. Every step felt like a battle, my legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion and dread. Lucas was just ahead of me, limping but moving, his flashlight bouncing weakly with each step. Nora was beside him, one hand gripping his arm, as if to anchor them both. I glanced back, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. Nothing. No movement, no shadows, no sign of the living void that had erupted from the altar. But I could feel it, its presence pressing against my back, seeping into the air, the walls, my thoughts. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. Derek was gone. The memory of him being swallowed by the darkness was burned into my mind. But there hadn't been time to process it, to mourn. Survival had consumed every thought, leaving no space for grief. Not yet. Ahead, the corridor opened into another chamber. You upstairs, applied. The space was smaller than the others, its walls slick with something that glistened faintly in the dim light. Symbols, sharper and more chaotic than before, were carved deep into the stone, their lines jagged and uneven. The air in the room was heavier, colder, and carried the faint metallic tang of blood. Lucas collapsed against the wall, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. Nora knelt beside him, her face pale and drawn. "We need to rest," she said, her voice trembling. "Just for a minute." "We can't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. The urgency in my chest was suffocating, clawing at my ribs. "Angry moaned. It's following us. We have to keep moving." Nora shot me a glare, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We're not going to make it if we don't stop. Look at him. Look at all of us. I wanted to argue, to force us back onto our feet and keep running, but my body betrayed me. My legs buckled, and I sank to the ground, my back pressed against the cold, wet stone. My flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, the beam casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Lucas groaned, his head falling back against the wall. "What was that thing?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. Nora shook her head, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know, but it's not stopping, is it?" "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It's not." The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The symbols pulsed faintly, their glow weak but steady, like they were biding their time. I stared at them, trying to make sense of the patterns, the shapes. They weren't random. Or they couldn't be. "There has to be a way out," I said finally, my voice firmer now. "These symbols, they're a language. They're trying to tell us something." Lucas let out a weak laugh, his head lolling to the side. "A language? Are you serious? You think whatever carved those things is trying to help us?" "I don't know," I admitted, my eyes still locked on the markings. "But we don't have any other choice. If we don't figure this out, that thing is going to." The walls trembled, a low vibration that sent dust and debris raining down on us. The hum grew louder, sharper, filling the space like a pressure building in my ears. The symbols flared suddenly, their red light casting the chamber in an eerie glow. Nora scrambled to her feet, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "It's here," she whispered, her voice breaking. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the void pressing down on us once more. And the shadows along the walls began to shift, twisting and stretching as though they were alive. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering weakly as the darkness closed in. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Lucas's arm and pulling him to his feet. He cried out in pain, but stumbled forward, leaning heavily on me as we staggered toward the far end of the chamber. The shadows followed, their forms rippling and contorting as they reached for us. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their chaotic voices blending into a single guttural tone that vibrated through the stone. We reached another corridor, narrower than the last, the walls closing in around us like a vice. My shoulders scraped against the jagged stone as I pushed forward, Lucas' weight heavy against my side. Nora was just ahead, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically as she ran. The corridor twisted and turned, the symbols on the walls growing more erratic, more frantic. The whispers followed, relentless, their voices echoing in my skull like 1,000 needles piercing my thoughts. And then the corridor opened into a new space. The room was smaller, its walls smooth and polished, the symbols carved into them glowing with a faint, steady light. At its center stood another pedestal, smaller than the one before, but its surface covered in the same jagged markings. On top of it rested a small circular object, a disc, its edges sharp and uneven, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols. Nora hesitated at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the pedestal. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my own voice shaking. "But it might be the way out." Lucas let out a weak laugh, his breathing ragged. "Or it's another trap." I didn't answer. My gaze was locked on the disc, its faint light pulsing in time with the symbols on the walls. The air around it felt different, heavier, charged, like it was waiting for something. Nora stepped forward, her movements hesitant, her flashlight aimed at the pedestal. The shadows in the corridor didn't follow us into the room, but I could feel their presence lingering just beyond the threshold, waiting. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice steady now. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice steady now. "If we stay here, it'll find us. This is the only thing we have." Without waiting for a response, I stepped toward the pedestal, my hand reaching out toward the disc. The air grew colder the closer I got. The symbols on the walls flaring brighter, their glow almost blinding. My fingers brushed the edge of the disc, and a shock ran through me, sharp and electric, making me gasp. The room trembled, the symbols pulsing faster, their light filling every corner of the space. The whispers outside the room rose to a deafening roar, their chaotic voices pressing against the walls like a storm trying to break through. And then everything went still. The stillness didn't feel like relief. It felt like the moment before a storm, a fragile calm that threatened to shatter at any second. My hand hovered over the disc, the faint hum of energy vibrating through my fingertips. The walls around us no longer pulsed, but instead seemed to hold their breath, the glowing symbols frozen in time. Lucas' voice broke the silence, trembling and weak. What just happened?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My focus was locked on the disc, its surface smooth and cold, yet alive with an energy I couldn't explain. It felt like it was waiting for something, like it knew more than any of us did. Nora stepped closer, her flashlight flickering weakly as she angled it toward the pedestal. "Oh, what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, my words heavy with uncertainty. "But we're out of options." Lucas groaned softly, shifting his weight against the wall. "If touching that thing gets us out of here, do it. If it doesn't," he trailed off, his words hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. We had no guarantees. I braced myself and wrapped my fingers around the edge of the disc. The second I touched it, a surge of cold shot through my hand, racing up my arm and into my chest. The symbols on the walls flared back to life, their light so intense I had to squeeze my eyes shut. The hum returned, louder and deeper, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the room anymore. I stood in a vast, endless void, the ground beneath me smooth, and reflective, like black glass. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and the silence pressed against me like a weight. I turned in place, searching for the others, but they were gone. I was alone. A low sound rippled through the void, soft at first, but growing louder. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The glass beneath me shifted, rippling like water, and a shape began to emerge. It rose slowly, towering and amorphous, its form shifting and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. The whispers returned, not chaotic this time, but deliberate, their voices blending into a single, unrelenting command. Choose. What do you mean? I said aloud, my voice trembling. The sound of my own words felt wrong here, swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive void. The shape in front of me stilled, its edges solidifying into something almost human. It didn't have a face, just a dark, featureless expanse. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and intrusive. The whispers grew louder, repeating the same word over and over, drilling it into my skull. Choose. And a flicker of light caught my attention, and I turned to see two objects floating in the void behind me. On one side was the knife Derek had taken, its jagged blade still glowing faintly. On the other was the disc I had just touched, its surface pulsing with an eerie red light. The choice was clear, but the implications were not. The whispers pressed harder, insistent and demanding. One saves, one ends. Choose. My chest tightened, the weight of the decision crushing me. If the whispers were telling the truth, one of these objects held the key to escaping this nightmare. But what did the other one do? What was the cost of choosing wrong? Endule, tapegde. The void rippled again, and the shape in front of me took a step closer. Its presence was overwhelming, its form distorting the air around it. I felt my knees weaken, but I forced myself to stay upright, my gaze flicking between the knife and the disc. I don't understand, I shouted, my voice cracking under the strain. What am I supposed to do? The whispers didn't answer. They just repeated the same word over and over, their tone growing sharper, more urgent. Choose. Ellie, choose. I closed my eyes, trying to drown out the noise, trying to think. The knife had protected us before, cutting through the shadows that chased us. It was violent, destructive, but it had worked. The disc, on the other hand, felt like something older, something tied to the symbols and the energy of this place. It felt like control. My hand moved on its own, reaching toward the disc. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the void around me exploded with light. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, their voices blending into a single overwhelming scream. The ground beneath me cracked and splintered, the glass shattering into endless shards, that fell into the abyss below. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I was back in the chamber, the pedestal before me, the disc still clutched in my hand. Lucas and Nora stared at me, their faces pale and wide-eyed. The room was silent again, the symbols on the walls dim and lifeless. What did you do?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the ground beneath us shook violently. Cracks spidered across the floor, glowing with the same red light that had consumed the void. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the air grew impossibly cold. "We have to go," Lucas shouted, grabbing Nora's arm and pulling her toward the corridor. "Hey," I followed, the disc still clutched tightly in my hand. The chamber behind us collapsed, the cracks spreading and swallowing everything in their path. The whispers chased us, their voices rising to a fever pitch. As we ran, the corridor twisted and turned, the walls closing in, the red light bleeding into every shadow. My lungs burned, my legs screaming for relief, but I didn't stop. The disc pulsed in my hand, its energy cold and sharp, guiding me forward. Even as the whispers tried to pull me back, we burst into another chamber, smaller and darker than the last. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low guttural hum that seemed to come from the very air around us. At the center of the room was a massive doorway, its surface covered in glowing symbols that pulsed in time with the disc. "This has to be it," I said, my voice shaking. The way out. Lucas and Nora exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "And if it's not?" Lucas asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. There was no other option. "You sail, dit fulne, barrel." I stepped toward the doorway, the disc in my hand growing colder, its glow intensifying. The symbols on the door flared brighter, their light blinding. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, the walls, my very bones. And then, as I pressed the disc against the door, the world shattered. The world didn't just shatter, it unraveled. The instant the disc touched the doorway, the symbols flared with a searing, otherworldly light that burned into my eyes even as I squeezed them shut. The air roared around me, a hurricane of sound and force that pulled at my body, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the chamber. The doorway, Lucas, Nora, all of it was gone. I stood in a vast, endless expanse. The ground beneath me smooth and dark, like polished obsidian. The air felt thinner here, the cold sharp enough to sting my skin. Overhead, there was nothing but a swirling void of shadow and light, constantly shifting, never still. I turned in place, my heart pounding. The disc was still in my hand, its surface cool and faintly pulsing. It felt heavier now, almost alive, as though it had become part of me. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, its form barely distinguishable from the swirling void. It didn't move, not at first, but I could feel its presence like a pressure against my chest. It was watching me, studying me, waiting. I stepped forward, the sound of my footsteps impossibly loud against the silence. Hello. The closer I got, the clearer the figure became. It was tall and humanoid, but its edges were blurred, as if it didn't fully belong in this reality. Its face, or the absence of one, was an empty void, darker than the shadows surrounding it. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder with every step I took. They weren't chaotic this time. They were deliberate, purposeful, their tone commanding yet strangely mournful. "You have come far," the voice said, "not in my ears, but in my mind." It wasn't a single voice, but a symphony of overlapping tones, both familiar and alien. "And yet, you do not understand." "Bah. What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate. The ground beneath me rippled, and suddenly I was no longer standing on smooth obsidian. I was in the grove, the ashen grove, but not as I remembered it. The trees stood tall and unburned, their branches thick with leaves that shimmered in the faint light of a long-forgotten sun. The air was warm, alive with the sound of rustling leaves and distant bird song. But it was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the way the ground seemed to shift subtly beneath my feet, the way the light didn't quite reach the edges of the grove. This wasn't real. It was a memory, a shadow of something that had once been. "This is where it began," the voice said, echoing through the trees. "Long before the fire, before the town, before you." The scene shifted again. The grove darkened, the leaves withering and falling away. The trees twisted and blackened, their trunks splitting open to reveal jagged, gaping wounds. "Ah, must." The ground turned to ash beneath my feet, and the air grew heavy with the acrid stench of smoke and decay. In the center of the grove, a massive figure rose from the earth, its form shrouded in shadow. It towered over the trees, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence radiating an overwhelming sense of dread. "The Hollow," the voice whispered, and I felt the weight of the name settle over me like a physical thing. "It has always been here, and it always will be." The figure turned its eyeless gaze toward me, and I staggered back, my chest tightening. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why any of this?" The whispers swirled around me, their tone sharp and relentless. "You came. You touched what was meant to remain buried. You woke it." The realization hit me like a blow, the weight of it nearly bringing me to my knees. This wasn't about the others. It wasn't about the grove, the town, or even the fire. It was about me, my curiosity, my determination to uncover the truth, my inability to leave the past where it belonged. "What do I do?" I asked. My voice barely a whisper. "How do I stop it?" The figure extended its hand again, and the disc in my hand flared with light. The symbols on its surface shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns, their glow growing brighter and more intense. The whispers grew louder, their overlapping voices blending into a single commanding tone. "You must choose," the voice said. "Seal it, or become it." The words sent a chill through me, my breath catching in my throat. Seal it, or become it. The choice was impossibly cruel, and yet it was the only one I had. The disc grew colder in my hand, its glow flickering like a dying flame. I looked at it, my heart racing, and then at the figure before me. The hollow loomed closer, its form stretching and shifting, its shadows spilling across the grove like ink. If I sealed it, would it truly end, or would it only wait, buried once more, until someone else stumbled upon it? And if I became it, what would that mean? Would I lose myself entirely? Or would I become part of the cycle, another link in an endless chain of suffering and despair? The whispers reached a deafening crescendo, their voices drilling into my mind. "Choose, pay." With a shaking hand, I raised the disc, its light growing blinding. The hollow surged forward, its form unraveling into a storm of shadows that engulfed the grove, the trees, the very air around me. And then I made my choice. And